About you, you are here, the audience, looking to understand how to maximize the benefits of cloud migration and modernization strategies. So whether you're just beginning your cloud journey or you're looking to enhance your existing infrastructure, this webinar will provide actionable strategies to help you achieve your goals. So welcome, and I will hand you over to Daniel.
Cool. Thank you. Thanks, Lauren. So I'm sharing my screen. I'm not presenting a PowerPoint today. It's an interactive session where I'm using draw.io on my computer. I've got a rough plan or agenda in front of me where we'll quickly go through the intro, the webinar format. As I said, it's going to be interactive. I'm going to draw on the screen and we'll take feedback from the survey to help sort of direct the way the session goes. With a technical focus on Azure and Amazon, reflected based on our survey results. So we'll quickly work through the survey, talk about a lift and shift scenario. I'll draw a scenario on the screen and talk about some pros and cons of lift and shift. And then some modernization strategies with some things that we can do for quick wins, some more complex improvements we can make, including, as the invite talked about, managed databases, object storage, containers, and serverless. There'll be lots of room for questions, and I'm happy to adapt the session as we go today. So you've all been posted a link in the chat, and I'm going to fill in some results here, but I'll talk you through it. If I just go out of full screen mode, and we'll quickly check that here. If I need to reload this one. Okay, we've got some responses. So I'm just going to pick the majority for these. There's only 7 questions. So going back to my checklist on the screen, we can see that most people, as expected, would be using some virtual environments already. We've got an even mix of Hyper-V and VMware and others, possibly Oracle, as Oracle VM, for example. So I'm just going to tick both of these to say we've got these both green. Personally, I love Linux, but I do a lot with Windows and Azure, so we're quite happy to talk about Windows in this environment. So that's definitely the majority today. In Azure, it's interesting. I thought that'd be closer to 50-50 for what we've got here, but certainly in South Australia, Azure is very popular, and Blue Crystal does support Azure customers here. And one I'm very interested to know is whether we've got custom apps or off the shelf. So great to see we've got custom apps we can do the most with. When we're talking about off the shelf, things change based on vendor support. It's not to say that there's nothing we can improve, but when we're talking about custom apps, there's really a lot of scope for how you can improve the environment. So that's good to see. Right, so we've got, I'm hoping this other is lots of people moving to Postgres. I should have put that on the survey, but we've got a lot of Oracle, and I deal a lot with Oracle in Adelaide, some SQL Server, but I'll just change this to say other. Right, and then lastly, just talking about HA solutions that are already in the environment. So it's good to see that a lot of people have HA planning in place. And for those that don't, this session and moving to cloud opens up the most opportunities, I think, to improve that high availability. It's not all about just moving from the data center. It can be improving what you've got. So thank you for those that have filled in the survey. I'm not going to go back and check it. This is what will help talk about what we're going to use today. Right, so going back to the plan, we're going to talk about a scenario for lifting and shifting. And we'll talk about a diagram with VMware and Windows. So I'll start a blank screen, put some shapes up here. So first we're going to draw just what a common environment would look like if we have a Windows machine. Obviously, there's all sorts of versions around, some old and new. And we might have a Microsoft Internet Information Server, very, very common, and that serves a lot of static content. So websites with static content obviously can include reports and images. And for our dynamic content, there would often be on a Windows machine, probably a large .NET environment. We could also have Java and a whole mix of other things as well, whether that's Perl or Ruby or Python. So this would be our server. It could be physical or virtual. Now, if we're serving this on the internet, we need to have SSL certificates. And I'm sure you all spend a lot of time dealing with Thought and VeriSign and others for certificates. Now we'll draw a box around that and say that that's our app server. I'm just going to group that so we can. So from this environment that we currently have to manage, we need to manage high availability. And some of you have covered high availability. This is commonly done with virtual machines. So by taking that environment, we can duplicate it on a VMware cluster. We now got 2 machines, and on premise, we might commonly put a load balancer in front that will talk to these. Now, if we're putting the load balancer out there, then these certificates would likely get managed here. And we see people all the time having to deal with certificate renewals. Some people use Let's Encrypt to renew certificates automatically, but that requires access to the environment from the internet. It's not always so easy. Now, so that's our first step in HA, is to have these 2 machines together. This might run on VMware, this could be a VMware cluster. So the other thing we need here is to have some shared storage for these, so that we can share some state between them. And with our database, I think the majority had others, so I'm not going to put Oracle on there. I'll put a nice little diagram of Postgres here. So these servers we could be using Postgres, and if we've got high availability for Postgres, we could have some streaming replication to another server here. This would be for one site. And then we commonly also have customers that then go and you could put a box around the whole lot and duplicate it, so that we have our primary and our standby. So these could be two completely different data centers. Standby. So hopefully we've started to draw a picture that you can all relate to. You may have this level of availability in place already. And that's just to draw a link there showing that we have replication. So this might be using VMware storage, Site Recovery Manager, and similar. Just going back to our plan. So this is our application scenario. And I'd just like to talk about some of the common things that are difficult to manage in this type of environment. And I can put a little text box in. Obviously, we've got high availability covered with our VMware. And in this case, we've got 2 sites. So we've got our DR covered by our second data center. But other things that we have to deal with day to day, we've got our OS management, including our disk space. The need to be able to deploy applications and to roll them back safely. Backups and snapshots. And I'm just going to draw a tape icon. So backup is a big thing. How how often do you have a scenario where you might be backing up these virtual machines in entirety, weekly, monthly, daily, storing tapes? We've got customers that have their tapes taken off site all the time. They manage lots of tapes. Other issues here we've got to deal with certificate renewal. Remembering that it has to, plus the cost, of course, with that certificate renewal, and monitoring, and also security is a key point. With our security, we need to deal with our patching and upgrades. So those are the common things we have to deal with on premise now. And this particular webinar is to talk about the lift and shift versus modernizing and improving that. So there are options to lift and shift and move this whole environment to the cloud. And if we look at, we've got, excuse me about that. Sorry, I'm looking for my icon, but I'm actually trying to show that we've got VMware, VMware as a service now on Azure, this one. So VMware, excuse me, I'll scroll in a bit. So VMware and Azure allows us to simply lift and shift and take this whole environment and move it into VMware. But we can also just migrate individual machines. But when we lift and shift, this helps us in, if we put some key points, it helps because we can put in minimal design. We need to put in minimal design up front to lift and shift. And we can use our existing skills. This is a big one. So that helps move quickly. And of course, the biggest reason we do lift and shift is to meet deadlines, the time constraints. But the issue in just lifting and shifting is we bring all the bad bits with it. This management is rarely improved. And often the high availability isn't improved either if we're just lifting and shifting a machine. So what I'd like to talk about first is some quick wins we can do from this scenario while still doing a bit of lift and shift. I'm going to make it, copy my diagram from here.
While you're making that happen, Daniel, I'll just prompt the audience. Does anyone at this point have any questions for Daniel? Just drop it in the chat.
Right, so I'm just transferred part of our image across that talks where we've got a picture of our application server and the database. So we can lift and shift using the Azure. There's the cloud migration tool. We can move this virtual machine straight into Azure as is. Or instead we can straight away look at, instead of moving the database server, so this might be our primary, we can lift and shift this database. Just going to choose Windows on here. This database server on Windows. Or we can straight away move and start to use a managed database. So if we can use a flexible, in Azure, we can use the Postgres flexible server. It can be fully managed, and including our high availability. So we can have two of these in separate in even different regions. So for example, we can have, this could be our Sydney region. And within a region, we can have different availability zones. So this can be managed by Microsoft for us. This replication here. And we can have multi-region capability straight away with Postgres. So this deals with the database. We don't have to worry about the management or patching of that as much. But there's a lot to improve still from the point of view of the web tier. So we'll talk about the web tier for a little bit. And the first is, instead of having these static images, which can be huge and have to be backed up on the application server all the time, we can use some object storage for this. So in Azure, this is called blob storage. So by using blob storage, we can reduce a lot of management. We can add versioning, which can prevent accidents happening. We can add some controls for, we can put delete. Excuse me, let's check. Right, so in Azure specifically, we talk about the worm storage. So write once, read many, and we can put a legal hold on storage and have continuous incremental backups as well. So this reduces the need to back up this whole virtual machine all the time. But to make this blob storage useful, we want to change the web tier. And we'll change that by putting the Azure front door in front of it. So Azure Front Door is a fully managed service with Azure. By putting Azure Front Door, we can get that to directly take files out of Azure Blob Storage. So we're offloading the processing that would normally be done by the Microsoft IIS to Azure Front Door and Blob Storage. So Azure Front Door, we can also take the certificate management out. So if we put our certificate maps against Azure Front Door, then certificates can be renewed automatically and they're free. So we no longer have to deal with the private keys and the certificate requests and uploading them and renewing them in time. That management is completely offloaded to you. We can straight away do some improvement for security by putting a web application firewall in front of this. If I just quickly that. So Azure Front Door, we can put a web application firewall in front of our application straight away to improve security. This can do things such as restricting by the region and IP address, but also inspect the actual requests going to the application as well, and especially avoiding things like denial of service. So back at our little virtual machine that we would have moved, we can now delete the certificate management. We can take away the web server. The static images gone. We can still move this remaining component as a whole. Excuse me, resizing that one. We can still lift and shift this VM. So when this now sits in the Sydney region, Azure Front Door can send the static files off to our blob storage, and we can send dynamic content straight into this web application server. So we'd still lift and shift this to meet our deadlines, but we can add a bit of security straight away by moving part of the web tier out. So to cover off that, we've talked a little bit about object storage here. The fact that the object storage is also much cheaper. So nearly a quarter of the cost of storage for SSD, and it reduces a lot of our load on backups. Again, the durability of object storage is much higher than what you'd get with just a single disk in a VM. Now, perfect. I made a separate note here to point out that this isn't just website images. We've often got databases that store binary objects in them. And a very common scenario might be photos of people or objects. Those are perfect things to move into object storage and reduce the size of our database so that it's smaller, more efficient, quicker to back up. Now, we've talked about the managed database can give us some performance and reliability. The fact that we can resize the database more easily as needed, but especially if we do want to talk about serverless, if we use the serverless options, which allows the database to automatically increase the number of CPUs as needed. So these are our quick wins. Quick wins are to move out the database tier and the web tier, and hopefully the object storage as well. Yeah. If any questions about that before we talk about how we can improve this even further? Cool. That's right. So hopefully you can relate to some of the things we've drawn there already. A common thing also I want to talk about with the object storage in the case of websites where people might need access to the website to change the files. We can even offload the process to upload and manage these files. And Azure has a managed SFTP service we can do for this.
Daniel, we do have a question in the chat.
Okay.
Possibly responding to your prompt. So from Brody, do the Azure migration tools allow for migration from Oracle VM?
That's a good question. I haven't done that yet. There's the Amazon one I have used for that because it does the replication from the VM itself. And I think we can do the same from Azure just by replicating, treating it as the storage within the individual VM. We don't have to worry about whether it's hosted on VMware or Proxmox or Oracle VM or anything else. We can just replicate the block changes. I haven't done that with the Azure tool. We can look into it. The alternatives for Linux is obviously things like rsync, but Windows is a bit more complicated. We do want the block level changes replicated. The Amazon migration tool does that really well. I haven't tried it for Microsoft yet, but yeah, I'm sure we can. Sorry if I haven't answered that fully, but we definitely have done it with Amazon, and from what we're seeing, most of the migration tools are pretty much identical and don't depend on the virtual host infrastructure. There's lots of chat messages, but I think I can reply. Cool. Good. Right, so we've improved the web tier and reduced the management as well. So we talked about back in in our previous box here where we talked about OS management, deployment, and rollback, and we've covered the certificate renewal, security and patching and upgrades. If we look at our web server here, this IIS server obviously has to be patched all the time, and as does the operating system that it runs on. And we need to look at scaling this, making sure that the machines are the right size, making more virtual machines, and possibly having to buy new hardware to do that. By offloading the object storage to the blob storage in the Azure storage account and offloading SSL processing and the web application firewall, there's a lot less load on this machine now. So it's a lot easier to scale that. And we don't need to patch these tiers. So the IIS has come out of the picture there. So the last bit that we can improve significantly does take a lot more. So hopefully I've shown that we can we can lift and shift everything, but I'd like to avoid it by suggesting we re-architect quickly to use managed database or the web tier. Lifting and shifting the application itself is the quickest thing to do. But then we want to try and make an improvement on that. So after the quick wins, we've got some more complex work we can work through. And what we've found is a really good way to do that is to replace these application servers with containers. So we've got the Azure Container Service. Right. So instead of using our migrated virtual machine, I'm going to highlight that red. That's the one we want to get rid of. We can do some work to test this application. The testing is a key point. We need to test it and make an image for it. And we can store that image in the Azure Container Registry. So we have the container registry, which has our application in it. And we can create container instances from this as well. These can scale automatically and dynamically. They're serverless, so we don't have to think of the size of this machine. We can just put our app here. And we can start to move out the individual apps. So this container might run a .NET application, and this container might run a Java application. Now the front door can automatically send our requests through to here. The front door can send requests directly to these container instances. So now instead of managing a Windows server with dependencies, the .NET frameworks, of which there's many, or the Java versions that are all connected together, we can now start to focus on applications instead of server management. And this removes our need to patch the Windows server or .NET. We still need to keep this up to date from a security point of view. But instead, what we would do is we can do some tests. We can create our own Docker image for testing. And not every application is suitable for this. That's why I asked at the start from our survey whether we're running custom apps or off-the-shelf apps. If it's off-the-shelf, there may not always be the option to do this. But if it's custom, you'd be able to test your code and dependencies in a Docker image. We would upload these images into the container registry, and then we can launch these containers in the account. This also significantly improves the processes we use for a test environment because we can have a completely separate account for our testing.
Daniel, while you're doing that, we've got a question in the chat.
Okay, I'll bring that chat up. Sticky sessions when handled. Okay, so sticky sessions we can manage with. Sometimes we need to use the application gateway as well. So in Azure, the front door is a worldwide service that can cache content at the edge. If we need some more advanced control over the load balancing and options, we can get the Azure front door to connect to an application gateway instead. And this gateway can then connect to the container instances. But definitely we can support using sticky sessions for those. Hopefully that answers the question for that. Now, of course, if we're going to scale these containers horizontally, which we do, we want to be able to have serverless. One of the benefits of serverless is not over provisioning our hardware. This virtual machine may have, we put a text box in here, we have to choose how many CPUs this has. 2 CPUs, for example, and 8 gig of RAM. We have to plan for that sizing, even though we may not be using it all the time. And quite often the application server might have multiple applications in there. And so it's hard to know which application is using the most resources and managing them individually. And we often pay for CPU and memory that we don't need. By splitting our applications out into separate containers, we can now scale these individually. So if this Java process needs more containers for a while, then we can create more of those automatically and then delete them as needed. So the serverless helps us manage scale and load much more effectively. Just quickly reviewing my plan. So we've talked about more complex scenarios with containers, which can help us with the flexibility and the efficiency and consistency. Now we've talked about serverless and avoiding to have virtual machines of a certain size at all. And the two remaining improvements I want to do that talk about in the time we've got left is automation, and this one I think we've already covered. The survey showed that not everybody's using Oracle and SQL. As much as I personally love Oracle, I do like helping people make that work in different environments or move off it to Postgres. That is certainly an option to move to Postgres, like the Postgres flexible server in Azure. We can change the size much more dynamically and cover that off with the serverless architecture. Automation is something I'm very keen on improving, and that is rather than having these application servers where we manage the state and have change control, and people are very precious about their application servers and maintaining them for the long term. We want to see these as stateless, and instead of using things like Puppet or Chef or Ansible to deploy configurations to virtual machines, we want to use things like Terraform. Terraform works in Oracle, Amazon, Azure, even on-premise in VMware we can be using Terraform. But also we can use Azure DevOps and have the code managed in a repository with an approval workflow where all of the components that we've put on the screen today are managed in code and deployed in a controlled way and reproducible without people having to do any clicking at all. So perfect opportunity to improve how those things are managed. Now, just talking about which management areas we've covered off, we've talked about DR, we've covered straight away with the database, and we don't have to back up these virtual machines anymore. So by having that container registry, we can easily deploy machines in a new environment if we start it up. In fact, the DR is also improved with the automation, because if we're using DevOps to build an account, we can and should practice building whole new accounts for testing the environment using the same containers and then throwing them away when we no longer need them. This helps with deployment and rollback. We don't have to back up snapshots of virtual machines. We covered the certificate renewal already, and security, the patching and upgrades. So these containers still need to be patched and upgraded, but we can use Microsoft Defender in the cloud to scan these container registries for us and tell us when there's vulnerabilities. And we can be regularly building new Docker images and deploying them into this container registry to cover that off, and then rolling them out without any downtime. So we don't want people having to log into servers and patch them at all anymore. But just check my plan. I think we've covered off that improvement as well. I've got 1 minute left, and I think I've covered everything here. So I'm open to questions and answers on anything, and quite happy to go into more detail on anything we've talked about for the rest of our time today.
So any questions from the audience, please do drop in the chat. But I do have a question. How would this be different in AWS?
Okay, good question. So we drew on the diagram today Azure and Azure architecture. That's what most people have. And for the most part, Azure and Amazon have exactly the same services available. So in Amazon, we would use CloudFront. And CloudFront offloads the SSL processing and lets us we can put a web application firewall on CloudFront. We can also use the Amazon Certificate Manager to offload dealing with the certificates. And we can use Amazon's Route 53 in front of this to direct the requests to CloudFront. From CloudFront, we then need to manage the other objects we've got. So we have we might have a virtual machine, but instead we'd prefer to run serverless. So S3, this is where our static content comes from, our object storage. And then our dynamic Java application can run in Fargate is the icon I'm looking for. Search for that. So Amazon serverless option, we can, of course, lift and shift straight into an EC2 virtual machine. But in the end, we want to evolve that and move that into Fargate. So Fargate runs our containers. CloudFront will send our content into Fargate here. And Amazon also has a container registry for our Docker images, which is this one. So our container registry has the Docker images that get launched onto here. But of course, I forgot the most important thing, and that is to have RDS. So Amazon Aurora would be, if we're using Postgres, Amazon Aurora is a great option for adding scalability, including the serverless option for our database tier. So we can make it all fit in Amazon too.
Thank you. All right, well, no, there's no other questions in the chat. So I'll take my time and say thank you, Daniel. Thank you to everyone for joining. We hope you got a lot out of the session and found it very informative, valuable, and insightful. We are dropping some share links in the chat. So please do follow us on LinkedIn. We do share amazing content. Now, I understand your scenario may not have got addressed here today, and that's okay. And don't worry, because we do ask you to keep an eye out over your inbox in the coming days, because we are sending out invitations for a free consultation. So it's a great opportunity to discover more about today's topics and see what's possible for your specific scenario. And of course, we can help you with anything you might need. So thank you again for spending your time with us. When you do hang up, there is a quick feedback survey at the end of the call. So we really do value your feedback so that we can make more of the things you want to hear about. So thank you again for your time, and we look forward to connecting again soon.
And there are some questions.
Sorry.
Okay, experience with estimating prices for, I'm happy to keep talking all day if the webinar keeps going all day. Experience estimating prices for workloads when using the many services. So that can be challenging. Obviously, the first thing or the easiest thing to do is we would look at our architecture for our application server. So we'll go back to this page. Excuse me, I'm just moving controls out of my way after looking at the chat. Right, so this is our application server. The most common approach is to go and look at this server, or indeed the virtual host that it's running on, and we estimate the cost for the CPU and RAM. But ideally, we'd want to, by re-architecting that and offloading so much content, especially the static images, we can certainly estimate the size of the static content and work out how much that's going to cost in object storage instead, which is around about a quarter. This significantly reduces the size of the storage volume, the SSD volume or premium or ultra storage that we have for the application server. It also reduces the backup space. So we can start to take those things out of our calculations. The cost of front door and the SSL certificates are free. We can put an estimate of front door. If you've got the statistics there, we can look at how many requests you do per day or month and extrapolate that out to calculate a cost for front door in front. And then we're left with the CPU that's remaining for the container service. And to start with, we'll just have to, it's going to depend on load testing. So we can start with the CPUs that you already have on premise that are working, but we would prefer to actually set up a test environment with some load testing on it so we can see how the container performs and how well the application works when we scale the containers out. And then we can come up with some costs for the containers. But certainly we have done those estimates on that before. And yes, there is, of course, the pricing calculator does have all of these services in it.
All right. Any other sneaky questions? We're happy to stay on and chat. Just let us know. Otherwise, like I said, we will email you after this with a link to the video, as well as some handy resources and, of course, an invitation to have a free consultation. So I'll close it up and say thank you very much again for your time.
Thanks for joining in.
Yeah. Thank you, Jen.
Thank you. Okay.